Jamie and Lynn. While I'm getting set up here, I want y'all to do me a favor. I want you to look at your bulletin and tell me what today's date is. December 28th. Very good. That's exactly right. So that means we have had December 26th, we've had December 27th, and today's the 28th, 3 days since Christmas. I'm going to show you what I have left over from Christmas. Well, I have leftovers and leftovers. These are going to go away a lot faster than those. Let's see, I have, a really bad gift that I don't have the heart or receipt to return. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. There are pine needles all over my house. The tree that was once this beautiful centerpiece of the home has now become sort of just a dried up nuisance. And a little bit of tooth decay. And just to clear things up, someone asked me earlier, Bath & Body Works is not sponsoring this message today. It just was the first bag that I grabbed. Just want to clear that up. But this is Christmas. Or at least it's the remnants of Christmas. I thought that Christmas was supposed to be all about peace on earth and goodwill to men and tidings of joy. But I didn't find any of that in my bag. And I haven't really found any of it in the news. And I haven't found any of it in the shopping centers that I have visited in the last several days. And so once again, it begs me to wonder, what was all this about? Does it make a difference? And I know I'm not the only one that wonders about this. There is actually a diagnosable condition called post-holiday depression. And it hits us because we go into Christmas with these high expectations of what it's going to bring and how things are going to be different after Christmas. But what we find oftentimes is we're just left with stuff. But the good news is, Paul's text to us today tells us what Christmas really is. That it's more than this. That it's something much greater. And I want to read Paul's words to you once more because I think they bear repeating. Paul wrote to the Galatian church and he said to them, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father.' So you are no longer a slave, but a child, and if a child, then an heir through God." That is Christmas. And it changed everything. But not in the way that is portrayed, or maybe in a bigger way that is often portrayed. We think of Christmas as the day that the Son of God was born into the world. Sure, that's true. But I want to challenge you to think of Christmas a little differently. I want to challenge you to think of Christmas as the day that you were born into the world as a child of God. Christmas is oftentimes painted for us as this day when God, who's angry and doesn't know what to do with us and is at his wit's end, kind of comes up with a last-minute plan. And he sends Jesus into the world. And Jesus sort of becomes the great peacemaker, the great appeaser of God's wrath. But Jesus didn't come to earth to make us worthy of God's love. Jesus came to earth because God decided from the beginning of time that we would be worthy of God's love as God's children. Did you hear what Paul said in the text? He said that Christ came so that we would be willing to receive adoption. Christ didn't come so that God could finally receive us. He came so that we would finally have the desire to receive God as our Father. Jesus came not so that God could once again love us. Jesus came to show us that God has always loved us. We've just been too blinded by our sin, our pride, our low sense of worth, or maybe our high sense of worth, in order to see it. And so this is Christmas. It is not the establishment of a new religion. It is not the establishment of a new set of rules or a new set of theological ideas that you must believe in order to be right with God. Christmas happened to completely revolutionize the way that the world saw God. I want you to bear with me here for a moment because I want to talk about something that I think is important for us. At this time in the world, in the biblical times, in the times of Jesus and that part of the world, you really had two different views of God. On one hand, you had the Jewish view, the Hebrew view. And what we know from reading the Gospels is that the Hebrew faith had become very contractual with God. It was this idea, if you do this, I'll do that. If you don't do this, I won't do that. That's a contract. A contract is two parties telling each other, this is the least I can get away with and still be a part of this contract, right? Hold that thought. Over here, you had the Greek philosophers, and they were trying to figure out who is God. And what they decided, to boil it down very simply, they decided that God must be the total opposite of what we are. And so if we are changeable, God must be unchangeable. If we are affected by time, God must be unaffected by time. If we are here, God must be there. And so when we merge those two views together, we get a picture of a God who is very strict, a God whose love for us depends on our obedience to God's standards. We get a picture of a God who is very distant, very cold, very unaffected by the world. But then Christmas happened. And the very God of creation, who we thought demanded the highest sense of purity, was born in a filthy stable. Put away your nice Christmas card images of the manger. Raise your hand if you've ever been in a barn. A lot of you. My grandpa was a dairy farmer. I grew up playing in the barn with the cows, and those were some of my best memories. But you know what I remember the most? I would walk into the barn. I kind of had this move down pat. Here's the barn. I would go, and then I would hold my breath as long as I could because I didn't want to breathe that air in. But God, who is holy and pure and who expects nothing but purity, allowed that same sort of stench to fill his fresh, newborn lungs. Christmas happened. And the very God who was thought to be unchangeable and unaffected by the world took on human flesh and took on the ability to be affected by everything that has ever affected humankind, past, present, future. Christmas happened and it painted a new picture of God. Not a God who is a harsh taskmaster expecting perfect obedience, but a real and personal God who expects justice and mercy. Not a distant, unaffected deity, but a God who has literally had the dust of the earth on his feet. He has tasted bread on his tongue. He has felt tears on his face. He felt the cold steel in his hands. Christmas happened. And the God who knew what it was to hold supreme power chose to give up that power in order to live in a world that was full of threat and uncertainty. In order to stand in total solidarity with us. In order to enter into the human situation, to change the human situation. And the unaffected God was so affected by our chains that he took on those same chains of death and he defeated them. He crushed them forever. And so this is Christmas. It is the freedom from sin. It is the freedom from slavery that tells us that we have to earn our right into the kingdom. Because Christmas is God telling us, I will be the one to make it right. I will take on the burden of fixing this. The burden that you have to carry is a very light burden. It is the burden of simply receiving. The salvation that Christmas brings is life everlasting, but it's not a life that begins the day you die. It is a life that began the day Christ was born. And Christmas happened not to please a vengeful God with a sin offering, but to show us that all along God has been the one making offerings to us, offerings of love and forgiveness and peace and hope. This text, it calls to mind for me another story in Scriptures, one that's pretty famous, a story that Jesus told. It's the story of a young man who developed a really off picture of who his father was. And he began to almost hate him. And so he decided he didn't even want to be a part of this family anymore. And so he went to his dad and he said to him, "I want my half of your estate now." Basically, I want to live as though you're dead, as though you don't even exist anymore. I can imagine those words stung pretty deeply. But for whatever reason, the father complied, and he gave the son everything for which he had asked. And the son takes off. And for a while, life is really good. But soon the money runs out. And the so-called friends disappear. And the love he had experienced in the night grew cold. The drink ran dry. And despair grew exponentially. And he found himself in a place lower than anything he could have ever imagined for himself. And in that place of deep despair, he remembered something. He remembered who his father really was. He said to himself, "What am I doing here? My father is so kind and compassionate that even the lowest in his house are treated with goodness and with love. Maybe if I craft a speech that's just perfect, and maybe if I plead my case, and if I beg and I confess and I tell him everything I've done and I grovel at his feet, maybe, just maybe I can play on that compassion and he'll let me back into the home, even just as a slave. At least the slaves have a roof over their head and 3 meals a day." And so he decides to make the journey home. And as you can imagine, over those several days, he crafted and wrote and edited his speech, and it was going to be so eloquent that there was no way his father would turn him down. And so he walks and he walks until he reaches a point where he sees the road ahead. It's a long road, but it's a path that leads to his dad's home. So with humility, he takes that first step. And when he does, he notices something in the distance. But then he realizes it's just a cloud of dust. Nothing that uncommon this time of year. And so he takes another step and another step. And he realizes the dust cloud was coming right towards him. And he hears a sound. And it was the sound of flip-flops, sandals hitting the ground. Feet were running towards him. His heart begins to beat rapidly, and he gets a little shaky and a little lightheaded because he realizes, okay, it must be one of the servants in the house. They're coming out to see who I am. I mean, look at me. I'm covered in filth. I'm totally unrecognizable. I need to make sure I say the right thing to this servant because I need access to my father. Even just 2 minutes. What am I going to say? But then he looks up, ready to give some sort of reason for his arrival, and he freezes. Oh, he had the perfect speech prepared, but he found himself speechless. Before he could speak, before he could think, before he could blink, he is wrapped up in an embrace that is unlike the superficial embraces he'd been experiencing in his time away. It was an embrace that was unassuming and yet all-consuming. It was an embrace that was full of passion and full of compassion. And it would have knocked him to the ground had the arms around him not been so tight that they held him up. He began to feel the dirt from his face wash down his neck as his face is covered in kisses and tears. And in that moment, he realizes, it's my dad. And time stands still. Because he realized, I don't have to give a speech. I don't have to beg. I don't have to plead. I don't have to grovel. My dad's been waiting for me to take this first step since the day I left. And I never lost my place at the table. I never lost my sonship. All this time, he's just been waiting for me to come home. And after what seemed like an eternity but was really just a few moments, he does the only thing he knows to do. He wraps his arms around his father, and for a moment the two are inseparable. This, my friends, is Christmas. Christmas is the strong embrace that is so full of passion and compassion that it really would knock us to the ground were it not for the Father's strong arms holding us up. Christmas is the cleansing power of the tears and kisses that are shed for us when we take that first step home. Christmas is God telling us, I don't care where you've been and I don't care what you've done. I just want you to come home. I just want you to come to the place that I have always had set for you. Christmas is God saying to you, you mean everything to me. And so I will come. I will run to you. I will make this right. You no longer need to climb your way to God. You just need to kneel before the manger. You no longer need to plead your case like an attorney in a courtroom. Just sit in silence at the foot of the cross. You don't need to beg for a place in God's kingdom. You just need to offer up words of gratitude and thankfulness as you gaze into the light of the empty tomb. This is Christmas. It is the offering to you, the gift to you that says, there is an empty place waiting for you. And if you will choose to come to me and to receive that place, you will live with me now and forevermore. Amen.